My name is Ella Graham. I'm 32 years old. I'm a senior software architect at one of the largest tech companies in the Pacific Northwest. I hold 3 patents. I've spoken at international conferences. And for 14 months, the man I was going to marry thought I was a secretary who could barely afford her rent. On a Saturday evening in October, I stood in a marble foyer in front of a woman named Patricia Whitmore while she whispered to her son, my fiancé, that I looked like the help who had wandered in through the wrong entrance. She said it quietly. She thought I couldn't hear. I heard every word. That night, 100 guests filled the Whitmore estate for what was supposed to be our engagement party. A string quartet played near the fountain. Waiters circulated with champagne. White tents dotted the manicured lawn. Patricia had spent weeks planning it. She had no idea what I had spent those same weeks planning. What happened inside that tent, in front of those 100 people, is something I will remember for the rest of my life. Not because it hurt me, but because it was the moment I stopped hiding who I was and showed the Whitmore family exactly who they had underestimated. This is that story. Before I go any further, if you end up connecting with this story, please take just a moment to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you know. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love reading those, I really do. Now let me take you back to 14 months ago, when everything started. My grandmother raised me. She had to. My parents died in a car accident on a Tuesday evening in February when I was 7 years old. I remember the exact quality of the light that day, pale and thin, the kind of winter light that gives no warmth. I remember a social worker with kind eyes and cold hands. And then I remember my grandmother's kitchen, the smell of coffee and toast, the sound of her old radio playing something slow and quiet. Her name was Margaret Graham. She lived in a modest house on a quiet street in a small town in Oregon. She drove a 12-year-old Buick. She shopped at the same grocery store for 40 years. She wore simple clothes and no jewelry except for a small gold pendant that had belonged to her mother. She did not look like a wealthy woman. That was entirely intentional. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that my grandmother had built a business empire in her 30s, invested wisely through her 40s and 50s, and quietly amassed a fortune that would have made most people's eyes water. She had sold her company for several $1 million the year I was born. She had accounts and assets that she never spoke about, never displayed, never used to impress anyone. She lived simply because she chose to, because she believed that character was more important than appearance, because she had watched, over decades, what money did to people who made it the measure of their worth. She passed when I was 24. She left me everything, her house, her investments, the pendant I now wear every day. And she left me a letter. I keep that letter in my nightstand. I have read it so many times the paper has gone soft at the folds. She wrote, "A person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. When they believe you have nothing to offer them, when they think you're beneath their notice, that is when you see exactly who they are." I was 24 when I read those words. I didn't fully understand them yet. By the time I was 32, I understood them completely. I started writing code when I was 15. A neighbor had an old computer he didn't want. I taught myself from library books and internet forums and the kind of obsessive focus that probably worried my grandmother more than she ever let on. I sold my first app at 22. It wasn't life-changing money, a few $1,000s, but it was proof that the thing I loved could also sustain me. I went back to school, then to a larger company, then to the one I'm at now. I've been climbing since I was a teenager, and I've never once stopped to look down. My salary is $37,000 a month, before taxes. After taxes, it's still the kind of number that makes accountants pause and ask if there's been a mistake. I have stock options, performance bonuses, and enough in savings that I could buy a house in cash and still have plenty left over. I live in a modest apartment. I drive the same Subaru Outback I bought 12 years ago. I cook simple meals and shop at regular grocery stores and own very few things that could be called luxury items, with the exception of a small, carefully selected collection of pieces I keep for occasions that require them. My co-workers assume I'm comfortable. My neighbors assume I'm ordinary. Most people who meet me for the first time assume exactly what the Whitmore family assumed, that I am unremarkable, adequate, common. I have never corrected them. My grandmother taught me not to. I met Marcus Whitmore on a Wednesday morning in August, 14 months before the engagement party, at a coffee shop 3 blocks from my office. He was handsome in an easy, uncomplicated way. Tall, blue-eyed, the kind of face that photographed well and remembered names at parties. He asked what I did for work. I said I worked in tech. He nodded in that way people do when they think they understand something they don't, and asked if I handled scheduling for the executives. I smiled. I said something vague about supporting the team. He filled in the blanks himself. And I let him. Why? Because I had been doing this my whole adult life. Because I had dated men who changed when they learned about my income, who became either intimidated or suddenly suspiciously attentive. Because I was tired of not knowing whether someone liked me or liked what I represented. And because, if I was honest with myself, my grandmother's lesson had become a habit. A reflex. A quiet, ongoing test that I gave to everyone who mattered. Marcus passed at first. He was warm and funny and genuinely curious about who I was rather than what I had. He asked about my grandmother, about growing up in Oregon, about what I loved about my work. He listened. He remembered. On our 4th date, he brought me a book I had mentioned once in passing, weeks before. I remember thinking, this one is different. We dated for 14 months. I fell in love with him slowly and then completely. The way you fall in love when you've been careful and then stopped being careful. By the time he mentioned his family, really mentioned them, with weight and context, I was already in. It was a Thursday evening in September when Marcus sat across from me at dinner and told me his mother wanted to meet me. He said it lightly, but his hands were wrapped tightly around his glass. He said his mother was very particular about first impressions. He said she could be a lot, but that she meant well. He said she just wanted what was best for him. He said the family would be there, his father Harold, his sister Vivian, and that it was going to be a formal dinner, which I should probably know in advance. I asked what I should wear. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long, then said whatever I was comfortable in. That hesitation told me everything. I went home that night and sat with my grandmother's letter for a long time. I thought about what it meant to be meeting the family of the man I might marry. I thought about what it would mean to walk into that house as myself, with my real salary, my real credentials, my real wardrobe. And I thought about what I would actually learn about these people if I did. And then I thought about what I would learn if I didn't. I made my decision before I went to sleep that night. I would show up as the woman they expected. Simple clothes, modest car, vague answers about work. I would give the Whitmore family exactly what they assumed, and I would watch what they did with it. My grandmother had given me the framework. The Whitmores were about to provide the data. I arrived at the Whitmore estate on a Friday evening in late September, wearing a simple navy dress, flat shoes, and drugstore earrings. I drove my 12-year-old Subaru up a driveway longer than some streets I have lived on. The gates were wrought iron with gold accents. The lawn looked like it had been measured with a ruler. Marcus met me at the door with a kiss that felt slightly performative, like he was doing it for an audience. His eyes traveled down my dress, my shoes, my lack of accessories. I saw something flicker across his face. It was embarrassment. He was embarrassed by how I looked. I filed that away. Inside, the house was a monument to new money trying desperately to look like old money. Crystal chandeliers in every room, oil paintings in gilded frames that turned out, on closer inspection, to be high-quality prints rather than originals, furniture chosen for appearance rather than comfort. And there, standing in the foyer like a queen receiving guests, was Patricia Whitmore. She was in her early 60s. Her blonde hair was set in a perfect helmet. Her smile was absolutely, completely fake. She extended her hand to me the way you extend a hand to someone you are tolerating rather than welcoming. I shook it. It was limp and cold. Then she leaned toward Marcus and said, quietly, with her mouth half turned away, that I looked like the help who had wandered in through the wrong entrance. She thought I couldn't hear. I smiled and said nothing. Vivian arrived 20 minutes late, which I would later learn was deliberate. She swept into the room wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, diamonds at her ears and throat, and delivered her greeting to me in a single word: hello. Not warm, not welcoming, just hello. Then she turned to her mother and began a conversation that excluded me entirely. Harold was quieter, shrewd-eyed, tired. He shook my hand with a grip that had once been impressive and was now just going through the motions. There was a fifth guest, Richard Hartley, an older man, silver-haired, sharp-eyed. He was introduced as a family friend and business associate. When he shook my hand, he looked at me with a flicker of something I couldn't identify, a faint recognition, quickly hidden. I didn't know him, but he seemed somehow to know of me. The dining room table seated 12. The silverware setting at each place included 6 forks. 6. I counted them. Patricia used the soup course to begin what I came to think of as the interrogation. Where had I grown up? A small town in Oregon. My family? My grandmother raised me. My parents had passed when I was young. She made a sound of sympathy that came out sounding like a drain unclogging and said how difficult it must have been, growing up without proper guidance. I said my grandmother had provided all the guidance I ever needed. She asked about my job. I said I worked in tech. She asked if I was a secretary. I said I was more of a support role. She nodded knowingly and said that was nice, that every team needed support staff. Marcus shifted in his chair. He said nothing. Then Vivian brought up Alexandra. She said the name so casually, like mentioning the weather. Alexandra, Marcus's ex-girlfriend of 3 years. Vivian had run into her last week, she said. Alexandra was doing wonderfully. Her family's import business was thriving. Such a lovely girl, so accomplished. Patricia picked up the thread immediately, with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Alexandra's family owned a luxury vehicle import company, such a perfect fit for the Whitmore dealerships. It was such a shame things hadn't worked out. I looked at the wall behind me. There were family photographs. In at least 4 of them, a beautiful dark-haired woman stood next to Marcus, her arm linked through his. Patricia watched me look at the photographs. She said nothing. Her satisfaction was almost palpable. By dessert, I had learned what I came to learn. The Whitmores were snobs of the highest order. They measured human worth in dollars and social position. They saw me as an obstacle, a problem, a mistake. What I hadn't yet learned was how deep the deception actually ran. After dessert, Patricia announced coffee in the sitting room. I excused myself to find the bathroom. I was walking slowly down a long back hallway, taking in the details, letting my mind settle, when I heard voices through a partially open door. Patricia's voice, and Vivian's. I stopped. Every instinct told me to keep walking. I didn't keep walking. Patricia was saying they needed to deal with the situation quickly, that Marcus couldn't be allowed to make this mistake. Vivian agreed. She said she had thought this was just a phase, like his vegetarian period in college. Patricia said this was more serious than a diet. Then came the words that made the floor shift beneath me. Vivian said the timing couldn't be worse, that they needed the merger with the Castagnano family to go through, that Marcus needed to be with Alexandra for that to happen. The Whitmore dealerships, she said, were in serious financial trouble. They needed the Castagnano partnership, the luxury vehicle importers, to survive the next fiscal year. Patricia agreed. She said Marcus had been supposed to keep his options open with Alexandra while they worked out the details. The Castagnano family would invest in the dealerships in exchange for access to the Whitmore distribution network. Options open. While he was proposing to me, I pressed myself against the wall. Vivian continued. She said Marcus was a fool. He had actually started to like this little secretary, this nobody. He was supposed to use her as a placeholder, someone to keep him occupied while the real arrangement was finalized. But he was getting attached, a placeholder. That was what I was. Patricia said they would handle it. They would announce the engagement tonight, get Marcus publicly committed. Then later, after Alexandra was secured, They would discover some terrible secret about me that would justify ending things. Invent one, if necessary. Vivian laughed. She said at least the girl was too stupid to suspect anything, that Marcus had picked well in that regard. She was naive, trusting, probably just grateful someone like Marcus had noticed her at all. I stood in that hallway for 10 seconds after they stopped talking. My hands were shaking, not with hurt, with anger. They thought I was stupid. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, looked at myself in the mirror, and made a decision. I would not confront them tonight. A scene would be dismissed. I would be called emotional, unstable, bitter. They would tell themselves I had proven their point. No. If I was going to respond to this, I would do it my way, on my terms, with a plan they would never see coming. I fixed my makeup, smoothed my hair, and walked back to the sitting room with a smile on my face. The game was just beginning. When I returned to the sitting room, something had changed. The furniture rearranged slightly. Patricia positioned by the fireplace with barely concealed anticipation. Marcus in the center of the room, looking nervous. Too nervous. He walked toward me, took my hands, and got down on one knee. The ring was large and flashy, exactly what Patricia would approve of. It was also, I noticed, of questionable quality. The diamond was cloudy, the setting uneven. It was the kind of ring that looked impressive in dim light and revealed its flaws in the harsh light of day, much like the man holding it. He asked me to marry him. Behind him, Patricia was beaming. Vivian offered congratulations with the warmth of a January morning in Alaska. Harold shook Marcus's hand. Richard caught my eye from across the room. His expression said he suspected this story had a few more chapters to go. I said yes. I took the ring. I smiled. I let Patricia begin talking about engagement party planning. And when Marcus walked me to my car that night and asked if I was okay, I told him I was just tired. I drove away from the Whitmore estate with his ring on my finger and a plan forming in my mind. The next morning, I opened my laptop and went to work. If there is one thing my career has taught me, it is the power of information, data, documentation. I spend my days analyzing systems, finding weaknesses, optimizing solutions. I applied those same skills to the Whitmore family, and what I found over the following days confirmed everything I had heard in that hallway. And then some. The Whitmore dealerships were in serious financial trouble, not a rough patch, structural failure. They had expanded aggressively during the boom years, taken on debt they couldn't service when the market shifted, and their main franchise agreement, the one that allowed them to sell new vehicles, was up for renewal. The manufacturer was actively evaluating other partners. Without that agreement, the business couldn't survive. The Castagnano merger wasn't a strategic opportunity. It was a life raft. But that wasn't the most interesting thing I found. The most interesting thing was Vivian. She had been embezzling from the family company for years. The amounts started small, hidden in expense reports, buried in petty cash accounts, and had grown steadily over time. Weekends at luxury resorts filed as business travel, personal purchases disguised as vendor payments. By the time I finished tracing the threads, the total was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I printed everything: legal documents, financial statements, records of suspicious transactions. I organized it into a folder that I kept in a drawer in my home office. Then I started making phone calls. My grandmother's name still carried weight in certain circles. The contacts she had cultivated over 4 decades remembered the Graham name with respect. When I reached out, they were happy to talk. One of those contacts knew Richard Hartley. I called Richard on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:15 p.m. He picked up on the second ring and said, before I could even introduce myself fully, that he had been wondering when I would call. We met for coffee the following Thursday. He arrived exactly on time and ordered black coffee and said very little until I had finished laying out what I knew. Then he sat back, looked at me with those sharp, quiet eyes, and told me his own history with the Whitmore family. They had cheated him on a business deal 15 years ago. Nothing that could be proven in court. Just the kind of unethical maneuvering that the law doesn't catch, but that leaves a person changed. He had spent those 15 years watching them, keeping files of his own, waiting for the right moment. He said I had just given him the right moment. He asked me one question before we finalized our arrangement. He said he understood his own motivations, but he wanted to understand mine. Was this revenge? Or was it something more? I thought about it carefully before I answered. I said it wasn't revenge, it was truth. I said the Whitmores had spent their lives using money and position to manipulate people, treating anyone they deemed beneath them as disposable. I said someone needed to show them that their money couldn't protect them from consequences. Richard nodded slowly. He said my grandmother would be proud. That was the moment I knew I had made the right choice. I told Marcus one evening that I was working late. Instead, I parked near the restaurant where he was supposedly meeting a client. He was not meeting a client. Through the window, I watched them at a corner table, Marcus and a beautiful dark-haired woman whose face I recognized from the photographs on the Whitmore estate walls. Their heads were close together. At one point, he took her hand across the table. At another, she laughed at something he said and touched his face. I took photographs, not for a legal purpose, for clarity, because I wanted to remember exactly who Marcus Whitmore really was. He wasn't just weak, he wasn't just a mama's boy. He was actively maintaining two relationships simultaneously while his family orchestrated the outcome from behind the scenes. I went home and added the photographs to my folder. The engagement party was set for 3 weeks from the night of the proposal. The evening before, Marcus and I sat in his apartment going over last-minute details. I asked him, casually, how he felt about us, about the future. He said he was excited, that he couldn't wait to marry me. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me, anything at all. He looked at me with those blue eyes. He said there was nothing. He said I was everything he had ever wanted. I asked about Alexandra. His face went pale. He recovered, quickly, practiced, and said Alexandra was just an old friend, nothing more. I nodded. I said I understood, and in that moment, I did. I understood that Marcus would lie to my face for as long as it served his purpose. He was his mother's son through and through. I went home and chose my dress for the next evening. Not the modest navy one, the other one. I know this is a lot to take in. If this story is landing somewhere real for you, you're not alone. Thousands of people have left comments on stories like this one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Would you have walked out the moment you heard those words in the hallway? Or would you have waited like I did? I want to know. The Whitmore estate had been transformed. White tents on the manicured lawn, crystal chandeliers hanging from temporary structures, throwing prismatic light across the crowd. A string quartet near the fountain. Waiters in crisp uniforms moving through the gathering with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Perhaps 100 guests, business associates, society figures, family friends, the kind of people whose opinions could make or break a company's future. Patricia had outdone herself. This wasn't just a party, it was a performance. I pulled up in my 12-year-old Subaru. The valet actually asked if I was with the catering company. I smiled, handed him my keys, and walked toward the main tent. With every step, I shed the persona I had been wearing for 3 weeks. My dress was deep emerald green, custom fitted by a designer whose name was whispered in fashion circles with reverence. My jewelry was understated but unmistakable to anyone who knew quality. My grandmother's diamond pendant hung at my throat, a piece appraised at more than most cars cost. My watch was a limited edition that only 50 people in the world owned. I had spent 14 months hiding who I was. Tonight, I would stop hiding. The first person to notice me was someone I didn't recognize, a woman standing near the entrance who looked at me, did a double take, and whispered something to her companion. They both stared. The second person was Harold Whitmore. His welcoming smile froze. His eyes moved from my face to my dress to my jewelry and back. I watched confusion replace his practiced hospitality. I said good evening, thanked him for hosting such a beautiful party, and moved on before he could ask questions. Word was spreading. I could see it in the whispers, the sidelong glances, the phones being subtly checked as people tried to figure out who I actually was. Good. I made my way toward Patricia's circle near the champagne fountain. She was laughing at something, head thrown back in that practiced way, surrounded by guests. She hadn't seen me yet. Then she turned. Her face went through a remarkable sequence in the space of 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then, just for a moment, before she recovered, something that looked very much like fear. She said my name like a question. I said good evening and thanked her for the beautiful party. Her eyes were moving rapidly, taking in every detail, the dress, the pendant, the watch. Vivian appeared at her mother's side, summoned by some invisible alarm. She looked at me and went through the same journey. Then, rallying, she smiled sweetly and asked if the dress was a rental. I told her the designer's name. He was someone who dressed celebrities, whose waiting list ran years long, who did not make dresses for administrative assistants. Vivian's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I excused myself to find Marcus. I found the cluster of industry figures first, the people whose opinions actually mattered to the Whitmore dealership's survival. The regional manager from the car manufacturer, several competing dealership owners, a journalist from the local business publication. I introduced myself properly. Ella Graham, senior software architect, and I mentioned my company's name. I watched their expressions change. A silver-haired man who ran a competing dealership chain said he had heard of me. His nephew worked in tech and had mentioned my name in connection with some innovative software solutions. A woman from a major investment firm asked if I was related to Margaret Graham. I said she was my grandmother. The woman's eyebrows rose. She said my grandmother had been a remarkable businesswoman, that the Graham name still carried significant weight in certain financial circles. Marcus had appeared at my elbow by now. His face was pale. He had no idea what any of this meant. He had never asked about my family beyond the most surface level. He had assumed poor meant unimportant and had never bothered to look deeper. His mistake. About an hour into the party, Richard found me near the rose garden while Marcus was pulled away by his father. He said the manufacturer's representative was here, that the man had already reviewed the documentation Richard had shared with him earlier in the week and was very interested in what it suggested. I asked if he was ready. He said he had been ready for 15 years. We finalized the details quietly, standing among the roses while the string quartet played something bright and cheerful 40 feet away. Then Richard walked back into the crowd and I returned to my role as the happy fiancé. For the last time. She found me near the bar about 20 minutes before the speeches were scheduled to begin. She pulled me aside with a grip that was stronger than necessary and demanded to know what I was doing. I asked what she meant. She said I knew exactly what she meant. The dress, the jewelry, the stories about my grandmother and my job. She wanted to know what my game was. I said there was no game. I said I was simply being myself. She said that was impossible. She said Marcus had told her about my circumstances. She said I was a secretary who lived in a studio apartment and drove a car that belonged in a junkyard. I said Marcus had made certain assumptions. I said I had never actually told him those things. I said I worked in tech, which was true. I said I had a support role, also true, since architects support the development teams. I said I had never claimed to be poor. I said I had simply never corrected their assumptions. She asked why. I looked at her directly. I said, my grandmother taught me that a person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. I said I had wanted to know who the Whitmore family really was. I said, now I knew. Her face went very still. Before she could respond, Harold's voice came over the speakers announcing the toasts. I know some of you are furious on my behalf right now. If this story is hitting close to home, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, called common by someone who thought they knew your worth, tap that like button. The confrontation is happening right now. Don't go anywhere. Harold gave his welcome speech. Patricia took the microphone from him with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had always known she was the real power in the room. She spoke about family, tradition, strong partnerships. She hinted at business opportunities, at growth and expansion, at the Whitmore dealerships entering an exciting new chapter. I watched the manufacturer's representative shift uncomfortably near the edge of the stage. I saw Richard catch his eye and nod almost imperceptibly. Patricia called Marcus to the stage. He climbed the steps, played his role, scanned the crowd for me. His expression was complicated in a way he couldn't quite hide. Then Patricia said she wanted to welcome her future daughter-in-law. She said my name. The crowd turned. I set down my champagne glass and walked toward the stage. The tent was completely silent except for my footsteps. I climbed the steps, stood beside Marcus. He reached for my hand, but his grip was uncertain. Patricia handed me the microphone with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said she was sure I wanted to say a few words. I looked at the microphone in my hand. I looked at the 100 faces watching me. I said, yes. I did want to say a few words. I thanked Patricia for the warm welcome she had given me. I thanked the Whitmore family for showing me exactly who they were over the past few weeks. Patricia's smile flickered. I said, when I first came to this house, I made a decision. I decided to let the Whitmore family see a simple version of me, a woman without expensive clothes or impressive credentials, a woman they might consider beneath their notice. I wanted to see how they would treat someone they thought had nothing to offer, someone they thought was beneath them, someone they thought was, in Patricia's own words, common. Patricia's face went white. I described the dinner. The whispered insult at the door. Being compared unfavorably to an ex-girlfriend in front of the whole table. The photographs on the wall. Being called support staff. Being called common. Marcus was staring at me. His face a mask of horror. I said, and then I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. I described the hallway, the conversation between Patricia and Vivian. Learning that I was a placeholder, someone to occupy Marcus while the family arranged his real future. Learning about the Castagnano merger and the financial trouble the dealerships were in. Learning that their plan had been to publicly commit Marcus to me and then invent a scandal to end the engagement once Alexandra was secured. Gasps moved through the crowd like a wave. I said, the Whitmore dealerships are in serious financial trouble. Their franchise agreement is up for renewal and the manufacturer is evaluating other partners. The merger with the Castagnano family is not a growth strategy. It is the only thing standing between this business and closure. I pulled out my phone. I held it up. The photograph was clear. Marcus and Alexandra at a corner table, his hand over hers, her fingers touching his face. I said, this was taken 2 weeks ago, while Marcus was supposed to be working late. The room erupted. Marcus grabbed my arm. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said he could explain. I said he had already had his chance to explain. I had given it to him the night before, and he had chosen to lie. I turned back to the crowd. I said, there is one more thing. The tent went completely silent again. I looked directly at Vivian, who was standing near the back, frozen. I said, Vivian Whitmore has been embezzling from the family company for years. The amounts started small and grew steadily. The total is now in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Vivian's husband turned to look at her. Vivian shouted that it was a lie, that I had no proof, that I was a bitter woman trying to destroy their family. Richard stepped forward from the crowd, carrying a folder I recognized. He handed it to the manufacturer's representative and said he had been waiting a long time for this. He said the Whitmores had cheated him 15 years ago. He said when Ella had approached him with evidence of their current conduct, he had been very happy to contribute what he knew. Patricia's voice rose. She said this was outrageous, that she would sue us for defamation. I said she was welcome to try. I said everything I had shared was documented and verifiable. I looked at Marcus. He was still standing beside me on the stage. He looked like a man whose entire world had collapsed in the span of 4 minutes. I reached up and removed the engagement ring from my finger. The cloudy diamond caught the tent lights. All its flaws were visible. I said I would not be marrying Marcus Whitmore. I said the only reason I had accepted his proposal was to give the family enough rope to hang themselves. I handed the ring back to him. I said he should give it to Alexandra. She was clearly the one he actually wanted. He said that wasn't true. His voice broke. He said he had feelings for me. He said the thing with Alexandra was just business, something his mother had arranged. I said, "That is exactly the problem. You let your mother arrange your life, your relationships, your future. You never stood up for me, not once, in that dining room, when your family tore me apart. You lied to my face about Alexandra when I gave you the chance to be honest. A man who cannot be honest with the woman he claims to love is not a man I want to marry." I set the microphone down on the podium. I walked off the stage. The crowd parted for me like water. I didn't look back. The cool night air hit my face the moment I stepped out of the tent. Behind me, I could hear the chaos beginning. Patricia's voice, high and desperate, trying to control a narrative that had already escaped her. The manufacturer's representative on the phone, his voice clipped and professional. Guests heading for the exits. I paused at the edge of the tent just long enough to take one last look. Vivian had cornered her husband near the bar. He was looking at her like he had never seen her before. Harold was slumped in a chair with his head in his hands, and Marcus was still on the stage, alone, the rejected ring in his hand, looking at the space where I had been standing. Richard found me by the fountain a few minutes later. He said it was done. He said the manufacturer had already made the call. The Whitmore dealerships would lose their franchise agreement by the end of the month. Without the franchise, they couldn't sell new vehicles. Without new vehicle sales, the business couldn't survive. I asked if he felt satisfied. He said satisfaction wasn't quite the right word. It felt more like relief, like a debt that had finally been paid. I understood exactly what he meant. He handed me his card and said if I ever needed anything, I should call. Then he walked back toward the tents, and I walked toward the valet station. I collected my old Subaru from a very confused attendant and drove away from the Whitmore estate for the last time. In my rearview mirror, I could see guests streaming out, the party dissolving into chaos. Patricia still gesturing, still trying. I turned my eyes back to the road and did not look again. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove through the night, letting the miles put distance between me and the evening. When I got home, I sat in the car for a long moment before going inside. I thought about Marcus, about the man I had believed he was and the man he had turned out to be. How close I had come to marrying him, to binding my life to his, to becoming part of a family that would have treated me with contempt forever. I thought about my grandmother, about the letter in my nightstand. A person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. I got out of the car and went inside. I made a cup of tea, changed into my old comfortable robe, sat by the window in the quiet of my apartment and looked at the city lights below me. I felt, for the first time in weeks, completely at peace. 1 week later, I was having my morning coffee when a news alert came through. Whitmore Automotive facing closure after franchise termination. The manufacturer had officially ended the partnership, citing concerns about financial management and ethical practices. Without the franchise agreement, the dealerships couldn't sell new vehicles. Several former business partners had come forward with their own complaints. An internal investigation had revealed financial irregularities now being reviewed by authorities. Vivian had been asked to step down from her position pending inquiry. The article did not mention my name. I had asked Richard to keep me out of it. This was not my story to claim. It was theirs, their own conduct, finally brought into the light. I finished my coffee. My phone buzzed. Marcus. He said he needed to see me, that he could explain everything, that he had made mistakes, but he still cared about me. He asked if we could just meet for coffee. I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I deleted it without responding. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. 6 months after the engagement party, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Marcus and Alexandra had reconciled. Officially, this time. Whether the Castagnano family's investment materialized in some reduced form, I don't know. I didn't look into it. I heard that Harold and Patricia had sold the estate, that Vivian's husband had filed for divorce, that the investigation into the financial irregularities was ongoing. I heard all of this the way you hear news about people you used to know, with mild interest and no real feeling. They were not my story anymore. I'm Ella Graham. I am 32 years old. I am a senior software architect who built a career through hard work and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't know when to quit. I make more money in a month than most people make in a year. And I live simply, in a modest apartment with a 12-year-old Subaru in the parking garage, because my grandmother taught me that wealth is not the measure of a person's worth. I still have the pendant she left me, the one I wore to the engagement party, warm against my skin every morning when I put it on. I still keep her letter in my nightstand. I still read it sometimes. A person's true character only shows when they think no one important is watching. The Whitmores thought no one important was watching. They were wrong. If you're watching this and nodding, if something in this story feels familiar, then I want to say something directly to you. People who measure your worth by your bank account, or your job title, or the clothes you're wearing, have already told you everything you need to know about them. They have told you that they are not safe, that their warmth is conditional, that their love comes with a price tag, and the moment you can no longer pay it, you will be disposed of. You do not owe those people your presence. You do not owe them your silence. And you absolutely do not owe them your future. There are 3 things I carry from this experience that I want to leave with you. First, being underestimated is not a disadvantage. It is an invitation. When someone dismisses you before they know you, they hand you something priceless, the element of surprise. Use it. Second, the test is not about catching people out, it's about truth. I didn't go to that dinner hoping the Whitmores would fail. I went hoping to be wrong about my instincts. The fact that I wasn't wrong saved me from making the worst decision of my life. The truth, even when it hurts, is always better than the alternative. Third, you do not need anyone's validation to know your own worth. Not a man's love, not a family's approval, not a stranger's opinion of your shoes or your car or your job title. My grandmother lived in a modest house and drove an old car and was one of the most quietly powerful women who ever walked into a room. She knew who she was. She didn't need anyone else to tell her. Neither do you. Some of you are thinking, was that too harsh? Should she have given Marcus more chances? Should she have tried to work things out with the family? Let me tell you something. A man who watches his mother call you the help and says nothing has already made his choice. A family that plans to destroy your reputation to serve their business interests has already shown you who they are. A relationship built on a lie, no matter how good the good moments were, is not a foundation. It's a fault line. You didn't walk away from that. You survived it. If you are in a situation right now where someone is making you feel small, feel grateful for crumbs of attention, feel lucky to be chosen by people who treat you with contempt, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not lucky to be chosen by them. They would be lucky to deserve you. Take care of yourself. Really, I mean it. If this story spoke to you, please leave a comment. Tell me, what moment in your life changed the way you saw your own worth? I read every single comment, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. There are more stories to tell. I'll see you in the next one.